So you've got your car, but it feels somewhat lacking in performance terms. And you look at your mates and the cars they've got, and you really just want to give your car a little bit of a performance boost just to make it more fun to drive and maybe even to perform better if you wanted to take it out on a track day. So this very focused video is going to look at the best ways of improving your car. Now, there's lots of mods out there that you can throw loads of money at, but they won't have that big an effect on the performance of your car. So we're going to try and focus particularly on the mods that are going to make a difference, or at the very least are going to open up the possibilities when you start adding other mods in the future. So if I was looking at a car and I just bought one and I wanted to improve it, here's really the first areas I would focus my attention on and the first mods that I would do. So with any form of car tuning or performance, what you really want to do is to get the car to burn more fuel, and to do that it needs more air. So any way of increasing the amount of fuel and air going into the engine are ways of increasing the performance output of your car. Now, the first mod most people do to their car is a very simple mod. It's an air intake mod, or an air intake upgrade. Now, it's not a great mod in terms of the power gain. In fact, most drivers won't really notice much of a difference. Perhaps at the top end, when you put these on the dyno, you'll typically see around 5 to 7%. So not a massive gain. And in some cases, you actually lose power low down. So please let me know in the comments what your experience has been adding an intake improvement to your stock engine, and whether you feel that was worth the investment. It's certainly a good idea to do this because it opens things up for the future. You may well end up with a restriction in that intake where it can't flow sufficiently well because of all the other mods you've done. So upgrading the intake certainly would give you an advantage. So what are the different options you've got when it comes to improving the intake on your car? Well, the filter itself is an obvious point of focus here. The filters fitted by manufacturers tend to be made of paper. They're very dense, very heavy, and they certainly do restrict the airflow. So the first easiest thing to do is to just swap that for a high performance filter. Now, high performance filters tend to be made of a cotton gauze material, or maybe even foam. Cotton gauze tends to give better effects in terms of performance and filtration, but there's a lot of different options out there, and we discuss these in detail in our videos on intake. So be sure to check those out for a little bit more of a primer. But just changing that filter can improve the airflow through the intake. But actually, looking at the airbox it's housed in, the pipework going to the airbox and the pipework from the airbox to the intake, they're all also potential areas of restriction. So fitting a full induction kit, so you would tend to think of an air intake in the shape of a cone, or cone filters, or pod filters they're often referred to. And these are basically round filters. They usually have a much larger surface area than the stock paper one, although some generic these fit any car brands have a smaller surface area than a lot of factory fitted ones. So you just need to be careful, make sure you are buying an upgrade. But those filters can actually remove the restrictions that you may well find in the intake. Now, what is a ram air intake? Well, the ram air intake basically takes the effect you get of rushing through the air in the car, and it forces that air into the intake. So that sounds like a really good idea, but in reality, the air that's being sucked in by the engine or by the turbocharger, if you've got some sort of forced induction going on your engine, is going in pretty fast. So you need fairly significant speeds to make a sufficient pressure differential to get an effect or an increase in power from that ram air effect of forcing the air in. The other danger you've also got with a lot of ram air setups is the risk of sucking water into the intake, because it tends to be completely open to the outside to maximize the effect of pushing the air into the engine. You run the risk of pulling water in whenever it's raining or whenever there's damp conditions. So that's certainly something to watch out for. You do tend to get what you pay for. So some of the more expensive brands do perform better. There are obviously some exceptions to that. So as we get an opportunity and the funds to test certain models, we'll certainly be publishing reviews and passing on our findings when it comes to air intakes. So we've spoken really so far about getting air into the engine. It's just as important to expel that air. So we're looking at the exhaust system. So any area in the exhaust where there is a bend or a constriction or a change in size of the pipe or a pollution control, such as a diesel particulate filter or a catalyst, are all potential obstructions or bottlenecks in the system. So you really want to try and remove these. The key thing with exhaust and intakes is to look at the velocity of the air. You want the air traveling at a fair old speed. So you might just think of an engine as blowing a constant stream of air out of the engine, but it's not. It's a series of explosions going on in the engine. So you get a pulsing effect through the exhaust. So as those pulses travel, they create a little bit of a vacuum behind them. So we would call this the scavenging effect, where the exhaust pulses are effectively pulling the next exhaust pulse through. And it also helps to empty the cylinder fully, so there's no exhaust gases left in the cylinder when that intake charge comes in. So in most engines, you've got a little bit of overlap where the exhaust and the intake valves are open, just to push that last little bit of exhaust gas out of the engine and to suck in a little bit more fresh air. Then the exhaust closes up and the intake valve is fully open, allowing the engine to fully maximize its intake charge of air. So velocity is something that is affected by the bore size. Larger bore sizes actually flow slower. They can flow a larger volume of air, or exhaust gases in this case, but it tends to be going out at a much slower velocity. So getting the right size is critical for your engine. So for some engines, going beyond 2.5 inches or beyond 3 inches is too much, certainly at the lower RPM levels. But in other engines, you certainly need to exceed that, or maybe even have a twin pipe system, particularly if you've got a 6 or an 8-cylinder engine or whatever configuration that is, be it an inline or a V. So there's various components within the exhaust. You've got the expansion box, the mufflers, the silencers, the catalysts, the headers or the exhaust manifold at the front of the engine. So depending on where you live, there'll probably be different names for these items in the exhaust. And we've got other videos that go into detail on exhaust mods, so I'm not going to focus too much on the specifics here, but certainly fitting a faster flowing sports catalyst or DPF, diesel particulate filter, will aid performance. They tend to be the areas where there's the biggest bottleneck, along with the headers of the exhaust, the bit that's coming directly out of the engine. So if you can improve that, you'll generally see a little bit of a performance gain. But like intakes, it's not something most drivers would notice on most stock engines. It's only when you start doing other mods that these upgrades come into their own. If you've got a turbocharged engine, you may well find the turbo spools up a little bit more easily or a little bit more freely, particularly at lower RPM levels. So all we've discussed so far really is the airflow, the intake and the exhaust. The computer inside the engine is doing a lot to manage the way the engine works. And in modern engines with a turbocharger, it's controlling the turbo boost by controlling the flow of gases from the exhaust through the turbo. So a lot of control can be had over the boost characteristics. The fueling is also controlled with the modern fuel injection systems. You've got a lot of control over the fuel delivery duration. The spray pattern can be adjusted with different sized injectors and different nozzle designs. But the ECU really takes everything into account, and it does a certain amount of trimming. So if it notices that something is slightly out, it'll adjust things to keep things running as efficiently as possible and to extract as much performance as you can get from the fuel. So even without adjusting the ECU, if you've added other performance mods, most ECUs will run slightly more efficiently and take advantage of those modifications. But you really do need to get that ECU tuned or reprogrammed or remapped just to fully maximize all of the mods that you've done to your engine. So that'll give you direct control over the timing of the engine, the delivery of fuel. If it's got a spark, the timing of the spark is quite critical. That'll have a big bearing on how the power is extracted from the fuel as it gets into the engine. So I've done quite a few other videos about ECUs, about remapping, about tuning the computer in the engine. So watch those videos if you want more of an understanding as to how this works, some things to look out for. There's some common mistakes people make when they choose a company to perform this service. And there's a lot of different options. You can go for a full custom rolling road setup. You can go for an off-the-shelf solution, or even some sort of piggyback plug-in device. So the overall benefits you get from each of these is usually proportional to the price, to the investment that you make, with the more expensive options releasing that little bit more power from your car. So how much power will you get by tuning the ECU? It depends so much on your engine. If you've not got a turbocharged engine, you will generally only see about 10 to 12% more power. ECU really is a decent way of unlocking power on a stock engine. When you start adding other mods to the engine, changing significant components in the engine like the turbocharger, the injectors, the fuel delivery system, even the pistons, the amount of compression going on in the engine, and all the other aspects of the engine that would have a bearing on its performance, the ECU will fully unlock those, allowing you to extract all of the potential performance from your investment in mods that you've done. Typically on the intake, the air would go through a set of pipes and then it would be diverted off through a manifold into the ports on the head of the engine. So with the throttle, that's controlling the overall flow of air. But you've got to bear in mind that it's travelling at different distances along each part of the manifold. So for example, the ports in the centre of the engine block may well receive higher velocity and more air than the outside ports. So there's a little bit of an inherent imbalance in the engine just by having the one throttle body. So if you take the throttle bodies and you apply a different throttle body to each cylinder in the engine, it gives you a lot more control over the power delivery and makes things much smoother. So because each cylinder is now receiving a much more uniform air and fuel mixture, it will generally respond better, you'll get better power, and it will be burning more efficiently. Also bear in mind that a throttle body itself is going to restrict airflow. It's taking up a little bit of space within that intake chamber. So if you've got an individual throttle body for each cylinder, that is much less detrimental. There's a greater surface area going into each of the cylinders, so there is certainly less drag on that air. And most aftermarket throttle bodies are somewhat larger than the stock factory ones in many cases, although there's so many exceptions out there and it really does depend on the design of the engine and the design of the throttle body. The flywheel is something that can make quite an adjustment to the way that that power is delivered. So going with a slightly lighter flywheel will increase the engine's ability to increase and decrease the RPM, so it will feel much more responsive. And a more responsive engine is always a good thing, whether you're driving in everyday traffic or you're in a track environment. But if you go too light, you are going to start to have other problems with the engine. So there is an optimum there, and it depends on really how you're going to be using the car and how much mods you've done and what your overall power aspirations are for your project. So we've spoken so far about performance mods. Now, you really do need to think about the handling of the car, the way the power is delivered, the ability of the car to transmit that power to the roads. So tyres are really an often overlooked aspect to a tuning project. People often only change the tyres when the tread pattern is at or near the legal minimum, where actually they've already degraded significantly in the performance. So those tyres are your only point of contact with the road. They're having a phenomenal impact on the grip that you have, the amount of traction that you get when you put your foot down. So choosing the wrong specification of tyre can make a significant dent in the potential performance of your car. So you really do need to be very careful with your tyre selection. Generally, wider tyres, lower profile tyres often give better grip in the dry and on track conditions. They usually give much worse grip in wet conditions. And there's often a compromise between the tyre size, the profile, the width, and the rubber grade, depending on really how you're going to use the car. So again, we've got other videos that delve into tyres, tyre choices. We've just done one on the season tyres with a comparison between winter and summer and performance tyres, and also the all-season, all-round tyres. So watch that if you just want a bit of a primer when it comes to tyres. So we've dealt with the rubber on the car. So next thing really is to look at the suspension. So most people think about dropping the car and making the suspension firmer. So that's certainly something you would probably do to a track car to just maximize its performance. But you can guarantee that most tracks are relatively flat. They've got relatively well maintained surfaces. When you go out on the roads, I don't know what it's like in your area, let me know in the comments, but in our area, there are just so many potholes, so many undulations and bad cambers on the road and all sorts of other issues. You really won't get away with those really firm, really low suspension suspension settings, because what will happen is the wheels will just bounce over those potholes and the pits and troughs that you get on the road surface, and effectively that will affect the amount of grip. The tyre is literally not in contact with the road surface for large portions of time. So I note really what a lot of performance tuners do. For example, Brabus and Alpina come along, they take the stock factory setup, which often is relatively hard, and they fit slightly softer suspension. The key thing also with suspension is the alignment of the wheels. So setting a camber on the wheels and setting a little bit of toe in or toe out will dramatically adjust its cornering. The compromise is always between it being able to corner really well and straight line stability. So there is certainly a compromise between having a car that is fairly stable and easy to drive in a straight line, but also one that corners really, really well. So suspension is very much a dynamic thing. So as the car rolls into the corner and the alignment of the wheels and tyres to the ground change just through the cornering forces, that's all taken into account with the geometry and the setup of the suspension. If you get that wrong, it will adversely affect the handling and the cornering ability of your car. So you really do need to pay a lot of attention to the suspension setup, and a lot of factory setups don't really allow that much adjustment. So in those cases, you may need to fit some kind of camber kit, for example, to allow you to adjust the camber, but those are always a worthwhile investment. Other smaller components of the suspension system that can be revised is obviously the shock absorbers themselves, getting different springs, getting coilovers which can be adjusted in terms of ride height and often spring rate. They just allow a little bit more control, allowing you to set the car up as you want it to be set up, rather than just relying on an off-the-shelf setup. So you may well find that your preferences are slightly different to someone else's, just depending on how you drive the car and how you use it and what you expect from it in terms of performance and handling. The bushings are the bits that connect the suspension to the car, and they often degrade, and as they degrade there's a lot more excessive play in the suspension. You may even notice some bumps and rattles as the suspension starts trying to do its thing. So if your car's getting on a bit, it's certainly worth upgrading those bushings or bushes in the suspension. You can get polyurethane ones in various different grades, but don't go too hard, because that can also adversely affect the handling. You certainly want one that's going to perform well for a long period of time, so the cheap ones often degrade quite quickly. And there's usually a performance gain to be had just by replacing your old worn bushings with new bushings as specified by your manufacturer of your car. So we can't really talk about handling without talking about the braking system of the car. So the tyre grip is the essential here. Your wheels will typically almost lock up to give you the maximum amount of braking. So if you've not got that grip in your tyres, it's pointless doing any kind of upgrade to your braking system. But larger brakes, larger rotors or brake discs, again, the terms depend on where you live, but increasing the size of those will improve their ability to dissipate the heat that builds up from the braking process. Larger pads also likewise will give better stopping ability, particularly on prolonged use on track days where you're pushing a lot more heat into the braking system. So you certainly want to specify your brakes in accordance with your needs on the car and how you use it. For example, a track setup is not usually that good on the road. You'll get a lot more noise from the brakes, and often they take a little while to get into their operating temperature. So they're designed to run at very, very hot temperatures. They give all the braking ability really when they're warm, whereas most stock factory brake systems work very, very well from cold. But as they start heating up on, say, a track day, they can actually start to exceed their thermal abilities, and you can start to degrade. I've seen brake systems start to smoke. I've seen brake discs actually starting to warp or crack because of the excessive heat that's built into them. So as a safety thing, if you're using the car on the track, you really do want to think about upgrading the brakes. But in terms of a road car, if you're not pushing that much heat into the brakes, your money really is better spent on the tyres and the alloy wheels around them as well. So alloy wheel size is also another bearing. The larger those alloy wheels are, the heavier they will be, and they will adversely affect the handling. So often a lot of people fit the biggest rims they can on their car because it looks nice, it fits the arches well, but is that a performance upgrade? Well, in most cases, it's actually not. Those large, heavy rims adversely affect the handling. They force you to use very low profile tyres, which tend to perform much worse in wet conditions where, let's face it, here in the UK, we have a lot of wet conditions to drive in. So you're actually degrading the average performance of your car, whereas you think you're going out buying a performance upgrade. So be very careful when it comes to specifying the size of the alloy wheels that you get for your car. And in a lot of cases, the factory fitted 19-inch wheels can be improved by dropping down a little bit to 18 inches. It sounds crazy. Please feel free to disagree with me. Let me know in the comments what your experience has been. But in the main, I personally prefer the slightly smaller alloy wheel sizes, just in terms of the handling performance characteristics that I get. It just feels like I have much more control over the car itself. So when you start modifying your car, obviously it can be quite dangerous. You're dealing with a vehicle traveling at speed. If you don't know what you're doing and you mess up these performance upgrades, you can make the car quite dangerous. So certainly seek qualified help. Don't fit parts yourself if you're unsure of how to fit them. There's so many video guides out there, so many tips, so many helpful people around that can help advise you. Certainly tap into that experience and that wealth of knowledge. Also, you need to check that mods are legal in your area. A lot of mods in some areas are regarded as illegal, so you can end up with fines or citations just by driving a car with illegal mods. So do your research. Some areas are quite fortunate. You can almost do anything you want to your car and get away with it. In others, changing the smallest component is often outlawed. So you do need to make yourself aware of what those legal regulations are in your area when it comes to modifying, upgrading your car. We've got lots more videos coming up just to help you to get the most performance from your car. We'll be discussing the topics that I've mentioned in this video in a lot more detail, really breaking it down. We're going to try and look at specific makes and models and engine types and recommend very specific upgrades for those, just to help you to make wise decisions when it comes to tuning your car. We really do welcome feedback. It helps us to get out there. When people start commenting on our videos, we get to see what people have, what cars they have, what projects they've got, which is interesting, but it also helps me to shape future content on this channel.
So I hope this video has been useful to you. We'd love you to stay tuned, so please subscribe to the channel. If you could boot that like button as well, that really does help us to get out. Thanks for all your support and for watching this video, and I've lined this video up for you. Thanks for watching.